be a duo here. This is not going to be anything like Madama Butterfly. It's going to be perhaps closer to the magic flute. So at times I'll be Tamino, she will be Pamina. At times I'll be Papageno, she'll be Papagena. And maybe at times I'll be Sarastro and she'll be the queen of the night. I'll let you decide. Okay. The topic we're going to be covering for the next hour is going to be money and climate. And I want to start with a recollection of what Kyoto 1997 was. Kyoto was the beginning, perhaps, of this idea that if you produce emissions, you pay, and if you remove emissions, you get paid. And this allowed for a market between emitters and capturers, which was codified in the Paris Accord of 2015. This have here Article 21C, which is really the beginning of something very, very important. We're going to see much more of that, which is to make finance flows consistent with an agenda to remove greenhouse emissions. It's very important to talk today, though, about Article 6, which is one that recognizes that countries can also trade with each other. And I didn't have a lot of time to check what is going on in Baku, but I was told, I read, that in Article 6 of the Paris Accord, which allows for countries to trade with each other, it was actually amplified in the discussions that are happening in Baku. So I think a lot of these things are going to create cooperation between countries at three levels. And I told you, today is climate and money. And now we're talking about big money being transferred between countries. So according to this, we expect an implementation of three different tranches of the Article 6. One is cooperation between countries. The other one is mitigation or cooperation for mitigation between countries. And then additional collaboration between countries which are not subject to a market approach. So for example, if I'm a country, say China, and I want to work with a country, say Kenya, and I do something in your country that reduces your emissions, then I will be entitled to a credit for my own emissions because I help you reduce yours. Okay, that's essentially the subtext of this Article 6 of the Paris Accord. To understand better what these markets are like, I like to talk about this case. It's not something I was involved in, but it's something that developed in Australia. And it's the Nyaliga fire project. This is a very interesting example of a carbon trade. I don't know the size of this. I'm guessing it's about $1 million a year for 5 years. So it's sizable. And it has to do with a situation where a tribe created a corporation that was going to get paid about $1 million a year to burn the savanna in a controlled way. Let me explain. It's very interesting. Savanna fires happen at scale when they happen in the wrong part of the year. If you have a fire when the land is very dry, then they tend to burn faster. And so a corporation was created with funding from the government, the Emission Reduction Fund of the Government of Australia, so that they could do controlled fire during the wet season, not having to wait for the dry season. And so after this happened, here's some of the results that came out of that. Out of this controlled burning project, the area that was burned reduced by 33%. So you can consider this a type of a geoengineering focused on burning the savanna at the right place at the right time. The grass, all the wildlife are coming back, but you don't get paid for either of these two things. You get paid for this, which is that the actual emissions of CO2 in a documented way were reduced by 40%. So this entitles you to money. And again, this is consistent with the Paris Accord mechanism. The most interesting part for me is all of this is public information except for the amount of money. But everything else, all the documentation is public. And what I like to reflect upon, and I want to reflect with you, is that the documentation that was needed for this is what shows up on the screen. This is probably about 100 pages of documentation, very detailed, with a lot of formulas, with a lot of audit statements in a verified manner that have to be done. This is a carbon trade. This trade takes probably 6 months to set up, takes a lot of documentation, a lot of consulting companies' work and fees, and therefore it's very costly and very slow. The commission on a typical carbon trade is about 50%. 50%. Okay, so we're very far from the speed, liquidity, and ease with which you buy and sell anything else, stocks, bonds, or cryptocurrencies. We're very far from that. But I like to tell my students who are experts on, who like large language models, for example, that you could easily develop a large language machine that could go through this and within minutes do the trade for you. Okay. There's going to be a lot of science fiction in today's presentation, right? So yeah, this is our specialty, science fiction. So this is the type of science fiction because when it comes to climate and money, you have to be forward-looking. So this is the thought I want to leave you with, which is that when it comes to these new finance flows we're going to be dealing with, which will ultimately result in the reduction of emissions, artificial intelligence is going to play a very important role in the creation of new markets. And not only that, but when it comes to the pricing process itself, this is something which is going to require the use of a lot of artificial intelligence. I have here an example of, so this is something which is closer to what we're doing and related to the poster presentation that Franziska Sticklin is going to do a little later today, which is a project to develop a forestal carbon capture project. How does that work? You can create a forest or you can manage a forest for carbon capture. And if you are going to do that, how do you know the cost and the revenue parameters that are involved in that? So this is, there's an analogy with the fire project that I told you, but this is something which is emerging, is going to have perhaps a bigger impact. It addresses a very important economic problem, which is how do you do the economics of carbon capture? And on that, we're going to listen to the expert on this.
The duo works. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I think Luis did a great job setting the stage correctly, talking about how this, managing climate risks at the project level will work and then be realized as a financial value. And then this one is actually leading to the motivation of my own research as well. So this is why we try to split up the dual work because we are very much related. But before I start my part, I want to actually know about this room because I'll be talking about 3 large disciplines. So the first start from the climate data, is there anyone, computational scientist or a climate scientist who is actually digging the climate data and climate modeling and so on? I know there's a parallel session room that is actually dedicated to the climate modeling. Maybe they're there. Okay. And then the second pillar that I want to know is who is the engineering specialist? Okay. So are you also doing like an infrastructure project engineering and so on? Perfect. Chemical engineers in the room. Computational engineers. Okay, great. So yes, so we are going to talk about the engineering. Then the third part is the financial engineering. How many of you? Ah, okay.
Hello. You see the three pillars that she's talking about is from the magic flute, right? Sarastro, Tamino, and
We have the trio. Okay, all right, great. I really wanted to know the composition of this room because the research that I'm going to discuss is actually a combination of all three. Without missing one domain, I mean, this research doesn't work. So I will tell you more. So what Luis nicely set up with a very vivid picture. Let me just conceptually set this down. So when we are talking about climate risks, like can be physical risks, we can think about extreme weather event, but also the chronic climate conditions, changes, and so on. At the same time, as Luis mentioned, like we are having transition risks, competition that is coming from the new technology, including renewables, carbon pricing, carbon tax, whatever you call, and then also the market preferences are changing too. Consumers demand something, and then all together, this one is actually being realized as an economic value. So this is my first slide, and then I want to set the stage right and then give you very clear definition of our focus, which is climate-related financial risks. And then this is, I just wrote it down, refers to the potential economic losses and financial cost that infrastructure owners and managers can face due to the physical impact of climate change, as well as a transition to a low carbon economy. These climate-related financial risks are very important. And then, managing and also assessing and also managing this climate-related risk is very important to many different stakeholders. Let me just count a few. The first part is the asset owners. Why? Because climate change may destroy asset values. You might heard of stranded asset, which is the unanticipated. They can break down your the asset valuation due to the unanticipated write-downs, devaluation, and then conversion to the liability. Simply, you can think about coal mines, that has to be shut down before their, like a lifetime ends. This is actually stranding value, right? And then, you can find a lot of, conserving report, like how big it's gonna be the stranded asset. Like you can see trillions and, more than trillions. So, but, estimating how much it's gonna be is really hard because it depends on how you project your scenarios in the future, right? But this is critical for the asset owners. Who else is actually concerning about the climate-related financial risks? Investors. Because stranded asset is directly affecting the portfolio values. This is the, I think, very interesting graph that is coming out of my co-author's paper. So it's a little blur, but on the left side, this is the bank's loan portfolio. The top one is JP Morgan, the second is Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and so on. And then what they did is they look at how much exposure that the bank's loan portfolio has to the carbon intense assets. And then the one on the right side that you can see is, how much this, a bank portfolio is exposed to the default probability under 1.5 Celsius climate scenarios. And then the bottom is 2.0. So you can see the high correlation between the carbon intensity of your bank loan portfolio and to the probability of default. So portfolio valuation is important. Last thing, the asset owners, those asset managers, are like having this like a new dynamics, the valuation changes, and then the bank regulators and the policymakers are very much concerned about it. And if you can hear from the VIS, like they say green swan, which refers to unforeseeable and then rare event that is triggered by environmental factors that can lead to the severe financial consequences, even bigger than the global financial crisis. And then you can simply think about, like that can be realized as the insurance industry, and then many, like credit risks and so on. So, it can be start from the asset level, but that can go all the way to the systematic risks. So how are we doing these days? The asset owners and managers are required to disclose these climate-related financial risks. What is state of today? They are not doing it well. Even they don't have the tools or framework to reliably access and disclose the sufficient information about the risks that their asset is exposed to. This is a critical problem because the lenders, like the asset owners, cannot effectively allocate their money. Regulators cannot really expect effective oversight, and then so is the companies. They cannot really know like how much risk they are exposed to. So we need better tools and better framework for this. So I told you enough about what's the climate-related financial risks, and then why the accessing and managing these risks are important. Okay, then how the researchers are doing, including me. We've been working hard, and then we at the same time know that this climate-related financial risk assessment should be comprehensive. Comprehensive means that we have to learn how this climate risk is actually moved to the economics, and then from the economics to the financial value, and then this financial value can be realized as a sovereign level, bank portfolio level, and an asset level. However, the current state, the existing assessment tools are primarily focusing on macroeconomic indicators, which limits to the providing effective information about asset-specific investment decision making. I will tell you more now. So this one is just like a simple literature review. Like if you really want to know what's going on in the academia, for decades we've been studying how the climate risk is affecting GDP, labor productivity, and so on, so on, so on. Very recently, there is a study largely led by the central bank because they are caring about the systematic risks that is linking the climate risk to the financial risks. So one on the top, which is sovereign level, you can see many studies that is primarily led by the Bank of England, Bank of France, and Bank of Netherlands, and now many other central banks are doing. Portfolio level is doing okay these days, but what is largely missing is one on the bottom, which is the asset level. You can say, oh, I see the two bullets here. The one bullet is mine, and the other bullet is my colleagues. So basically, this asset level analysis is largely missing for many reasons. And then I will tell you why. But, okay, how are we doing? Asset level financial risk analysis can be top down or bottom up. And then what is dominant today is more about the top down. Why? Is because we are lacking a lot of asset level data. If you don't have the asset level data, like a granular data, you cannot really do the bottom up. Top down is more about, okay, how's your broad country or broad, geographical location is exposed to the climate risks, and then you kind of like go down to the asset level, but it's a lot of estimation. Bottom up is actually more granular, but you have to have a lot of assumptions there. Like what's gonna be the impact mechanism if the temperature rise to my like operation of assets and so on. We are not having a lot of consensus on this bottom up approaches. like I've been trying to do this, and then this figure is actually came from the report done by WRI, which I am very closely work together on this stuff. And then they've been fighting for years that to make sure that these mechanisms are proven and then be agreed by other reviewers and like potential users and so on. So that one is the thing. And then the second part is, okay, we are talking about the climate conditions or scenarios that never happened before in the past, right? And then many people are saying that when you are testing the scenarios, it should be the forward-looking. But those forward-looking climate scenarios is largely macro level. You can simply think about IPCC, IEA, and NGSF, and so on. They're great. They're forward-looking. They're looking over like 50 years and 100 years in the future. However, they are very much macro level. That doesn't really ring the bell to the asset owners that like, okay, if the temperature rise in 2 degrees Celsius, what's gonna be my asset located in Abu Dhabi will be affected. So, like a linking between the, like high level micro to the all the way to the asset level is not happening. So it's not only me saying this is. I highly recommend you to read this report done by the Bank of England. So what they're saying is, like this asset level approach is hard because like of course the lack of the data, but the second is like the timeline mismatch because like. The macroeconomic scenarios are like largely 100 years down, but like your heterogeneous assets have different timelines, different locations, and so on, and the impact mechanism is more heterogeneous. So those are the ones that are largely missed when you are to do the asset level analysis. And at the very beginning, I told you that I am very much focusing on the infrastructure assets, right? And then if you're familiar with how the infrastructure asset is being financed, like this is a part that is largely missing in the today's, asset level risk analysis tools. These days, like mostly available tools are only looking at the equity values. However, if you are looking into the infrastructure asset, it's largely highly leveraged, meaning that 70 to 80% of their values are being financed through the debt. And then like the equity investors and then debt investors, their interests are very different, and then the investment decision making process are very different. So when you are looking into it, we don't have any tools that is actually supporting the debt financiers investment standpoint. And then the other part is, infrastructure is actually basically linked to many different parts. But in the academia, it's happening. Oh, okay, I am the one who is only looking at the physical risks. And then I'm the one who is only looking at the transition risks. I'm only one who is looking at the chronic. I'm only one who is looking at the extreme. Infrastructure assets, if it's a sit there, it's actually a combination of all those type of risks. So, like we need the tools that can actually test all those in a combination of like a multiple risk factors. That is very important. Lastly, is there people coming from bank? Okay, my previous, my non-academic career was a banker. I was the project finance manager for the infrastructure assets, and then even today, what they are using is a spreadsheet-based model, which is two-dimensional, very much limited to what's gonna happen in the future. Like the first thing is. It is limited to accommodate those complex data like climate data and also all those socioeconomic data, and then also they are limited to testing over multiple assets that is actually compromise the portfolio, and then like for the climate scenarios, you need a lot of iterations. This one is very much limited in the Excel spreadsheets. And then advanced analysis, like a probabilistic modeling or sensitivity analysis, is also limited. And then automation can be really hard and very much subject to the human errors. So I am sorry, this is very depressing because I am talking about a lot of limitations and gaps and so on. But this is what we have right now. Now that I'm going to go on to like what's the solutions to it. But before I'm getting into it, Luis, do you have any questions or comment?
I'm looking forward to your framework proposal.
Okay, do you want to go
Tell
right
us how that
into
goes.
it?
Yeah,
Yes, yes. Okay, so this one is, years of the research that I've been doing with my Stanford team and also growing up with the international organizations and so on. So few years back, although I'm an academic researcher, like you can follow this thing as like a kind of like the entrepreneurship growing the thing. So the first part is, the proof of concept part. So 3-4 years ago, we actually built this in a conceptual framework that, how can we, access these climate-related financial risks in the infrastructure sector. But before doing so, I think I highlighted enough, like infrastructure assets are unique. How unique it is, from the financial perspective. I already told you it's highly leveraged. We have to look into the debt investors. What's so unique about the debt investors? This is a project finance 101. Let me, please give me 3 slides to explain why. Those infrastructure assets, even though it is owned by a certain company, but the size of the asset, a standalone asset itself is huge. So that is actually doing they are not actually being financed through the corporate financing, but through the project financing. So what they do is they build a special purpose vehicle, what is called SPV, and then do the non-recourse based financing, which means that if this specific infrastructure asset goes to default, this default or debt obligation is not going all the way back to the owner company. Sounds good, but in order to be this infrastructure to be bankable, that means your asset has to generate sufficient cash flow so that like a standalone asset can be able to repay the debt and interest obligations every single interest period. So for here, unlike the IRR or discounted cash flow based NPV and so on, we need to have like a undiscounted cash flow projection so that you can see that not any single time of my entire life cycle of the asset, I won't have any default conditions. So that's important part. Okay, so what is the go-to measure for this? So bankers are using what is called the DSCR, so debt service coverage ratio. It's a very simple equation. I know this room is full of scientists and mathematicians and like engineers. Very simple. Basically, it's how much cash flow that this asset is earning that specific period, divided by how much they have to repay in that period. So that means if DSCR1 means you're actually earning exactly the same amount of cash flow that has to be repaid. Bankers are very conservative, so usually they love to have a buffer. Like they hate you just keep right onto the one line. So usually they ask you to keep like a 1.5 to 1.8%. 1.8. I'm not sure what the ADIA is doing, but around that is kind of market convention. So if your assets DSCR goes under 1.5, your asset is still not in default. However, what you can say is, like this is the event of default can happen, which means that you are in the danger zone. So, if you're the investment decision maker, what you want to do is that, your asset is always above the DSCR1, safely speaking, above 1.5 or 1.8. All right, this is like accounting 101, where how this cash flow is being how calculated. But here, what is important is that there are four key parameters that is actually going toward the cash flow of the asset, which is the revenue, and OPEX, CAPEX, and financing cost. Why this is important? Because this is gonna be the critical component of the impact mechanism of the asset. I will tell you more later. All right, so good enough. You already mastered the Project Finance 101, Accounting 101. Now that this is the design of the framework that I am proposing, which I named CLIFIN, you will be able to see more technical detail in the poster presentation outside. But here, like, let me tell you what's a basic skeleton of this framework. So CLIFIN is the Python-based framework that has three main components that actually try to solve those, like inflexibility, two-dimensional limitations, and automation limitations type of problem. So CLIFIN core, the three components is CLIFIN core, CLIFIN infra, CLIFIN dataset. There's a reason why we structure in this way, but we will tell you more. So I'm going to be very quick about explaining these details. The CLIFIN core is an engine. So this is a domain-specific language-based module. They can actually build all those statements. So, why this is important? Because, if you are changing any conditions or specification to your projections, you don't have to go all those single objects on your model, but you can only change this engine thing. Let me go for this one first. The data set is where, like I am calling my, computational scientist fellows to come in and then play with me. The data set is the one that is serving this climate data and also the infrastructure data and also social economic data that will actually come into the play to do the, advanced analysis. So those are the input data. Then this CLIFIN infra is the one that like the financial institution like to see, like the cash flow projection, DSCR projections, and also the risk and impact analysis. Like if the temperature rise, how much does that mean to my DSCR and so on, and then the scenario analysis and stress testing and sensitivity analysis is something that is all happening in the CLIFIN infra module. Very conceptual, right? So if you're a user and if you come to the interface, this is what you're gonna see. So basically, one on the far left is, like you just input your data. You can input, like your whatever the climate data that you want to feed, so as the infrastructure data. And then CLIFIN will process within themselves, like there will be project cash flow, impact mechanism, like a sensitivity analysis and everything. And then they will give you the DSCR projections and so on. Congratulations, you endured all the way here. Now that it's a fun part, demonstration of the framework. But before I go into this one, I want to highlight first, this is not for giving you that, okay, under 1.5 Celsius scenarios, this is what's going to happen to your assets. Let's not look into the number, like a correctness of the number, but more about the demonstration. Because everything is very, the CLIFIN, like one of the I think biggest value that CLIFIN can provide is, like for you to testing all those heterogeneous, like conditions and so on. So we know that, you as a user of this framework can have different assumptions. So it's also based on the different assumptions. But, like this is, like whatever I put for my own assumption. The first part is a proof of concept kind of stage. So here, what we did is we applied the CLIFIN to the imaginary three asset types, which is natural gas power plant, coal power plant, and solar PV. for your information, Clifing can be applied to any type of assets, but we start from the energy assets because it's very straightforward to look at the analysis. And then what we did is we feed the model with 12 different scenarios. That can be single risk factor or a combination of multiple risk factors. And then we actually identify what will be the risk and impact mechanism. So meaning that, we go out and then look at the empirical analysis, from the previous research, defining the relationship between the temperature rise and then, either revenue, capex, opex, or financing cost of the assets. And then we were able to model this. And then this is some outputs. So those black dots are some part that is standing for your asset is actually default under that specific scenarios. And then what is good about this, this projection is you can actually know by when then your asset will be defaulted and by how much you will be defaulted. And then also because it's also projected one, so you can also see when your asset can be recovered from the default conditions. So this is, one projection, but, sometimes, it's nicely understood when you're looking at the graph. So this one is a single application case to the natural gas one. And then as you see on the top ones, which is over the single climate risk scenarios, natural gas is doing relatively okay because we are not seeing something goes under DSCR1. But if you see on the bottom part, when the carbon pricing or the competition that is coming from the renewable energy market comes in, then that's where the natural gas power plants is actually being more exposed to default conditions. What was more interesting is when we actually do the comparative case study, we actually run the same scenarios over different type of assets. And then the one you see on the top is a natural gas power plant one, doing okay, kind of going in the default later on in like a 15 years of time when we are having, carbon pricing in set. But, if you're looking at the core power plant in the bottom, then, you can actually see that they actually goes a default pretty early on in the projection period. And then the other one that I thought this, this case study was interesting is, the climate risks are working systematically at the same time idiosyncratic way. So there are some risk factors that is actually going negative on regardless of the asset type. Like for example, air temperature rise. That actually goes detrimental to any all type of assets. But if you are thinking about carbon pricing, that works positively on solar versus that is working negatively on coal and natural gas. Why this is important for the financial perspective? Because this can be the insight that you can actually use for the portfolio management. So that you can actually hedge your climate-related financial risks within your portfolio. All right, so this is still conceptual. And then in our very latest study, what we actually did is, we actually test the Clifing framework over, a 73 point of energy assets of the United States. So this is the actual location of the energy assets that we tested Clifing. And then this is some of the highlight of findings that we have. So here, the simple projection of DSCR under 3 different kinds of IPCC scenarios. And then, this is a mean DSCR projection. And then as you can see, coal is kind of like going down in terms of the DSCR. However, it has like a less variation by geographical location. Solar PV, it's relatively higher in terms of the DSCR, which is kind of robust. However, it has like a larger variation by the location. And then this one is, like the geographical distribution of the DSCR. Like for example, the top one is solar, and then solar is very attractive in Texas and California, where they have abundant, the source of energy. The natural gas is more vulnerable in, Texas and Louisiana because they are exposed to the high water temperatures and so on. You can also do the sensitivity analysis, and then you can do not only the scenario in sum, but also you can do the which single climate risk factor is most detrimental to my assets. So this type of sensitivity analysis is also possible. And then lastly, if you just, combine your the detailed climate data, and then you run, Climate over those, infrastructure assets, you can actually locate which one exactly is the location that goes vulnerable under which climate scenarios. So, this is all, demonstration of how the Climate can be used. And then I was just having fun with that. So I am this one made our team busy for last few years, and then we are actually moving forward on this in terms of the coverage and scalability and methodology. And then this is where I am really glad to be here to calling for the future collaborations. So the coverage part. I think this one is, at the same time, the strength of the Clyfin, but at the same time, the tasks that Clyfin can move forward. The first thing is, the value of the Clyfin is flexibility, meaning that you can actually apply Clyfin to any type of infrastructure asset, meaning that we can show the coverage and we can expand the coverage of the Clyfin. Right now we only have applied to the energy sector, but it can be data centers and any type of infrastructure. The second part is a scalability. So we are the scalability. This Clyfin is kind of like a skeleton of the interface, and then if we feed the advanced data, then you can actually go further. Meaning that if we can feed a global level climate data, we can actually extend the coverage, the scalability of the assets to the global level. But at the same time, then you can actually look at the portfolio level analysis and also the sovereign level analysis, which is the bottom up. The last part is methodology. Right now, I have to be very straightforward upfront. Right now, the variations that you are able to see is all because of the climate conditions that is differed by the geographical location. But what is also interesting is the impact mechanism itself can be different. What I mean is that, temperature rise is affecting the production of the energy assets by this point. You cannot really apply. The current design of the Clyfin is we are actually using this impact mechanism to every the locations. But you can actually differentiate this by the location based, and you can actually change the equation of the impact mechanism. This is where the machine learning can comes in and help to sophisticate the Clyfin framework. All right, and then the other one is the greatest value that I am seeing the Clyfin is that the current climate assessment is very static based. So your asset is there, all static conditions, and then you just test over several selected climate scenarios, and that's it. But what you really want to know is what if I change the financing structure or financing terms and conditions of my assets, or what if I change the operation of the assets and so on? How would that change my value, the asset valuation? This is something that you want to see. So the Clyfin can enable to do this feedback loop in the managing climate risks. where this can be helpful, I think the whoever owns the infrastructure asset will be definitely the beneficiary of this one. Also, the ones who are managing the assets, policymakers working on the energy planning, and then also the insurance companies that are actually dealing with the tail risks and so on, consulting companies and data providers. Last is, now that, like this climate is a growing thing, so I am actually calling for you guys to collaborate with us on, on climate modeling, climate data, also the infrastructure engineering, operations, and, economic analysis and, energy modeling and public policy. So that's about it. Luis? So please tell me that how your research can, contribute to our thing.
So what I want to do now is going to move to the methodological aspects of that, which is to discuss how machine learning and then artificial intelligence can come up into this. So I'm going to go back to my previous question, which is how to value this particular case of a forestal project. And I'm going to follow a three-step approach. First, we're going to use a supervised method of machine learning using labeled data. Then we'll do the unsupervised using unlabeled data. I'll show you. And then we're going to introduce the risk-based approach, which is closer to what So-Young was mentioning. And for that, I'm going to use this example. It's an example of, imagine I want to do have a database, which is a database for a forest of olive trees, a particular type of olive tree. You may not recognize the GPS location, but that happens to be somewhere in the Hajar Mountains here in the Emirates. I wanted to use a local example. And I have here a year by year, from 1990 to 1993. It's a very simple data set, and I have a biomass number. This is made up numbers. I just made them up for the purpose of this discussion. So imagine this is the data that you have. This is data given to you of how olive trees grow in the Emirates. That's what that's going to be. Then the first thing you need to do is I remind you, if you're doing a forest development, you're going to get paid for the forest as a function of its carbon capture. So I have to go from trees, which is biomass, to carbon capture. And that comes from different directions. And again, if you want to know more, you go to Francisca's poster presentation a little later today. Okay, so the biomass can be classified into dry. Then you have above ground and below ground. You need to know that. After that, you have to get into the details as to where that biomass is. Is it in the trunk, is it in the branches, is it in the leaves, and perhaps other things. Okay? So this is complex, how you go from the 10 kilos or the 12 kilos or the 14 kilos to the amount of biomass that you have in these different categories. So this is where you're going to use machine learning. Machine learning will be able to do that breakdown for you. Okay. Now, once you have that, then this will allow you to calculate the CO2 capture. And CO2 capture is measured in tons of CO2 per year. And you get paid $10. This morning we saw $50. That's the order of magnitude that CO2 is worth. So this is how you can value this particular forestal project. Today, this is done with approved protocols. Remember that long list of documents that I showed you earlier for the fire project? That's how every one of these deals are made. Okay. I believe that in the future, we're going to use machine learning to do all of that very fast. If we don't use machine learning, this will continue to be a very slow process, very costly, 50% commissions. It's just never going to happen. So machine learning will be what will allow us to speed it up and make it faster. Now, this is the simple approach where I have this beautiful database. But imagine that what I have is not that. I have satellite images. Okay, I don't have a table anymore. I don't know the species. I don't know the biomass. What I have are satellite images. And I have here the same location, Hajar Mountains in the Emirates, same years, 1990, 1991, 1992. And I have a series of satellite images. How do I turn that sequence of images into the same economic calculation as before? That's a challenge. And that is something that is doable now, again, using machine learning. This is what I call the unsupervised, because you don't have labeled data. What you have to have is a smart system that can turn the satellite images into the calculations needed for your carbon capture calculations. Okay? And this turns into a project, this is what we're working on, that will be able to do something very cool. You have a certain location, you have a certain tree type. I'm not going to use an olive now, I'm going to use a beech tree. And with that, learning from all of your forestal data structures that you have, learning from your database, you can come up with outputs, which is basically your dollars over time. This is how forestal projects will be priced. So if anybody is thinking of creating a forestal development project anywhere, this will give you the value of that from a carbon capture perspective. This is what you will be paid because of your carbon capture activity as a result of the price of carbon in the markets. Okay? All right. Imagine that you have a station without data. You're gonna plant a forest with trees in an area where there isn't a historical database. Then all of the outputs that you have are things that you don't know. Then you have to use again a different version of machine learning, maybe a nearest neighbor calculation, so that you can calculate the value of that project using similar data sets from different parts of the world. And this will be something that will allow you to price these carbon capture projects, and something that will allow for the development of more of these carbon capture projects around the world. The challenge with this is that investors don't know what the profitability of these projects are going to be. But again, using machine learning approaches, then you will be able to price what that value will have. And this can be extended to, for example, windmill farms, whether they are on land or especially on the ocean. Windmill farms in the ocean have the characteristic that wind is much more predictable over the ocean than over land. And predictability means that you can value these projects better. So this is some of the things that machine learning can do for us. And all of these things turn into money arising from saving on carbon emissions. And my last example in this area is something that happened in Kenya. I had nothing to do with this. It's just something that I read. We heard about Kenya this morning. I have another example on Kenya. A company, I believe a Dutch company, produced or brought to Kenya 880,000 water filters. And I want to show you how this led to, again, a collection of carbon credits. And that's because the type of water purification that we used in Kenya is the one on the left, through boiling. And now with water filters, you can use the one on the right through filtering. And it is estimated this led to eliminating 2.7 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. So that is going to be around anywhere from $27 to $100 million per year for a project like this. Okay, it's quite significant. So these are my examples when it comes to carbon capture. I want to now move to, I'm a mathematician. I think that's become very clear. And I want to say something that Paul Erdős, a very famous mathematician, said, which is a mathematician is not someone who knows how to add. I'm a mathematician. Very often I go to restaurants and people ask me to do the division for the bill. And so Erdős said, mathematician is not someone who knows how to add. He said, mathematician is someone who knows why or when to add. It's a big difference. Okay, big difference. And it is a very good example of that in what I'm going to show you. This thing I'm going to show you is something that I spoke about last year, but it's very significant. I need to remind you of that, which is one of my favorite tables is this one. This is the table of all the emissions of the countries in the world. And then, of course, everybody points to China as being the big emitter of CO2. If you think about, or if you reflect upon this table a little bit, you will realize that this table is not very meaningful because, of course, China is the biggest country, right? So the fact that it has the biggest emission is not a big deal. So what other people do is they look at this table, which is the emissions per capita, right? And now my question would be, which of the two tables do you prefer? You don't have to answer. It's a rhetorical question. They're both wrong. They're both useless. By the way, Canada is number 7 in either table. That's just a coincidence. The thing is, as I said earlier, a mathematician is not someone who knows how to add, but when to add. And the thing is that division is the wrong approach. Division is the wrong approach because emissions is a function of many things, not just people. It's a function of GDP, it's a function of even surface area. Like Canada, for example, we have a lot of agriculture, and agriculture has a lot of emissions, even if there are no people around, right? So, in a paper that we wrote, and which I already discussed last year, we wanted to understand emissions in socioeconomic terms, and what we found is that through another method, but think of it as linear regression. It's non-linear, but it doesn't matter. We found that emissions is due to a certain number of characteristics, and that's what I talked about last year. So it's not just people. That will be factor number 3. Okay, so you don't divide by people. You have many more factors, and when you have many more factors, you cannot just divide by either of them. You have to take all of them into account and perform a different type of mathematical approximation. All right. So the result of doing that is you can take countries, I have 16 of them here, where what you can do is you can see what their baseline should be by looking at all of their peers. All of the countries are compared with each other on the same footing, and then look at the deviation. So some countries, like that one, okay, is emitting more and more over time every year. This is with respect to their baseline. And another one, like this one, would be emitting less and less over time. I call this chromodynamics because you become greener, you become browner. Okay, so on those two colors, this is how you change. And there are some countries that just go up and down. There's no clear direction. But this, I think, is going to be very significant because as we get closer to the year 2030, I think a lot of those emission targets that countries have are going to have to be recalculated. As we see that we cannot meet those net zero targets, then they're going to have to be recalculated. And also recalculated because of Article 6 that I mentioned earlier, that countries will start to trade with each other and to start to buy those allowances from each other. So since last year, we've evolved that into not just CO2 but methane emissions. Methane has, again, this is now also came up this morning. Methane has a global warming potency of about 80. I think Steve mentioned 85, 84, something like that. It's much more warming than CO2. It actually oxides into CO2 after about 10 to 30 years. So it's not as bad. It tends to turn into CO2, but it takes 10 years for that. Nitrous oxide is another one. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to talk about methane. And in the case of like in the case of CO2, this could be produced naturally, but we're more interested in the one that's created by humans, the anthropogenic version of that. And this is joint work with Jennifer Chang and Besat Faras, two of my students that I'm working with. And what we did there is take a data source which comes from Yale's project on the environmental performance indicators, okay, EPIs. We performed a feature importance analysis of different methods that exist. I'm not going to describe them to you. I just want you to know that this is how it's done. And then we created different machine learning techniques and compare them to see which one of them will work better. The result of this was that we can compare all countries with their baselines, and we see that most countries are actually above the baseline. Very few countries are below baseline. And this is for the year 2022. And I can tell you that it seems that when it comes to methane emissions, which are not very often talked about, we're actually going backwards. We're not, the evolution seems to be even worse than with CO2. Anyway, so that's a result that we produced. But before I end this discussion, I want to mention another poster presentation that will be done today by Hamid, sitting over there, which is on backtest overfitting. And this is very important because in everything I've discussed here, we're always trying to compare one, say, a data set with another data set. And when the data sets are large, overfitting can become a problem. So he has a way of addressing that. He'll be talking about that. And the reason I want to mention this is because I want to now move to how can you use this to do causal AI. We saw the relevance of CO2 and the dependence of CO2 with respect to socioeconomic variables. So one thing that you can do if you're going to remove CO2 is you kill people. That would remove CO2. But that's not in our interest to do that. You could also take a piece of your country and give it to a different country. So Canada could give Quebec to France, and our emissions will go down. But we're also not interested in that. We're interested in figuring out a way in which we know what causes what and what we can do about it. And that's what causal AI does. I'm assuming that many of you are experts on causal AI, and certainly Abu Dhabi is the world capital of causal AI, I would say. Okay, but I still assume that maybe some people are not experts, and then I want to approach this causal AI discussion with a very simple question. If you want to have impact, what should you do? And I want to end with this positive note on what it is that we can actually do. And when it comes to climate, I remind you, there's things that we know. You know, risk management is classified into known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So the known knowns is that CO2 warms up the atmosphere and therefore makes it CO2 interacting with sun rays warms up the atmosphere. Okay, and then methane does it too, and NO2 does it too, and so does water, by the way. But we don't care for water because it rains and water just disappears from the atmosphere. Then the known unknowns are the real risks that we have to face and the real risks that we need to understand. And science is usually concerned with the known knowns, but where the interesting thing happens is in the known unknowns. And that's what So Young was talking about. Like 80% of her presentation was about known unknowns. That's where risk management lives, and that's what risk managers do. That is what investors do, because investment is an exercise in risk management. And that's where I live, that's where I do as a mathematician. And then we have the unknown unknowns, and there's nothing to say about that because we don't even know what that is. But we need to know that the unknown unknowns exist. Okay, this is not now a course on insurance premium, but if it was, the impact of the unknown unknowns is that there's always an additional risk premium that you should be paying for. You just don't know what that is. Okay, all right. So, and here now I need to discuss the difference between causality and association. Everything we've discussed, me in my presentation, and a lot of what So Young was talking about was about association, and that's what most people do because that is what most of the science that has been created does. So we can understand, for example, CO2 and methane in terms of their idiosyncratic relationships to its country. We can use this to target the emissions per country, but the thing is, how can we lower emissions? What can we do about that? How do we know that? What causal AI will help us to do that? What causes the emissions? We'll be able to answer that also with causal AI. And how can we lower them without affecting the things that we care about? How can we lower emissions without decreasing population? How can we lower emissions without affecting economic growth or minimizing economic growth? How can we lower emissions without affecting innovation, transportation, or anything like that? That's the key. And that is what causal AI will do for us. And I want to end with that discussion, again, with a special love for the fact that we are in the world capital of causal AI. Okay, Marcos is here, and a lot of experts in causal AI are here. So I'll try to do my best to explain that well. Association is what happens at the same time as something. Causality is what happens because of something. That's something which is more difficult to do. And I like to do this with, I want to have, this is the entertainment part of this talk. I want to do this using a fallacy approach to causal reasoning. Okay, I'm gonna use particular two examples of very well-known fallacies, or I mean, some people will say that they're not fallacies, that they're actually true, but I want to use them to explain what this is. You may have heard this argument that high emissions is actually green. Steve Koonin, in his book Unsettled, he actually poses a very interesting statement. He says that increased CO2 contribute to a greener world. Have you seen that? Yeah, he said that. He says that high CO2 concentrations are actually good for plants. They encourage plant growth and agricultural productivity. And it's actually conjectured that photosynthesis occurred at a time when CO2 levels were about 6,000 parts per million. We're about 450 now, something like that. So this is probably true. It's probably true that if we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, then we will have a greener world. The plants will love it. Yes? So let's analyze that. I'm a mathematician, so I want to analyze that by having a very simple causal diagram. So what Steve Koonin said is this: CO2 contributes to plant growth, and this is true. We know this is true. But there's a different part of the graph that's missing, which is that CO2 also causes the atmosphere to get warm. And this is a lab experiment. We know this for a fact. You probably know this. When you put food in the microwave and you turn it on, what gets warm? The water, right? That's why the plate doesn't get warm, because the radiation warms up the water. Well, water, CO2, NO2, they interact the same way. The plate doesn't, right? So oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen in the atmosphere, they don't care for the sun radiation. CO2 does, NO2 does, and water does too. But water is not a concern because it rains. So we think. We don't know. That's the unknown part of the equation. But this causal relationship is there. And it's this that we worry about, because it's not the green, it's not the trees that is the objective. The objective is that these warm up of the atmosphere can cause storms, floods. I have here a wink to Donald Trump. He said that increased temperatures and increased sea levels will create an increased coastline. You need a very strange geometry for that to happen, by the way. Okay? But it doesn't matter. Let's accept it. I can put it into my causal graph. It's no problem, because what a graph is just the implications. There's something called the weight of the graph, which is how big those implications are. So I can even allow for that statement to go into my graph, right? And then storms can cause loss of money and maybe loss of life. Floods, the same thing. And increased coastline, I'm not sure. but I can still have it as part of my graph. So this would be the causal graph. And what Steve Koonin is talking about is one of the branches, which is true. The concern are the other branches, right? So, okay, so is that clear? Yes? So that's how a mathematician thinks. Okay. I have another one. This is actually, I like this more. He says, global food production has significantly increased in the 20th century as the world experienced warming. He said that. Okay. He refers to growth as a major benefit, in contrast with narratives surrounding climate change impacts on food supply. So he's trying to say that increased emissions is actually good for the production of food. So I'm going to give you the causal diagram for that. Okay? I have CO2 and I have hunger. And he's right. An increase of CO2 is correlated with a decrease of hunger. It's true. We have data for that. But as Marcos will explain very well, this doesn't mean that one implies the other. This is what's called association, not causation, right? The actual picture is this, is that food, an increase in food supply, together with an enhancement of global supply chains, has contributed to a decrease of hunger. This is true. And engineering is what caused the increase in food supply and also the creation of agromechanics in the 20th century. And engineering also increased the transport, which in turn increased the global supply chains. So this is the causal graph. And of course, transport and agromechanics contribute to the increase of CO2. So this is the full causal graph. It doesn't mean that if you eliminate CO2, you eliminate hunger. Marcos has a very good example, which is there's a correlation between the sale of ice cream and people drowning on the sea. You've seen that many times, right? Well, the reason is that you typically sell ice cream in the summer. In Abu Dhabi, maybe not. In the rest of the world, yes, and that's when people drown at sea. So you may think that if you declare ice cream to be illegal, then you're going to save people from drowning, right? Not true. So that's how causal graphs work. And here's the causal graph for Steve Koonin's statement in his book. And so it's clear that eliminating or increasing CO2 is not going to have any impact on hunger. We know that because the impact on CO2 and on hunger is by other factors which cause both of them. And they have a name. These are called confounders. That's the term that we use for causal AI. But I'm still going to use this graph. I like this graph because I'm going to use this graph to explain how directed acyclic graphs work, which is the basis for causal AI. And there's perhaps 4 terms for graphs. We already saw the confounders. These are facts that imply 2 different things that may seem correlated, but they're not because they're caused by something else, right? Then you also have colliders. These are, you have the full graph here. You probably already know this, I'm assuming, right? So let me just move on. And then the way you use causal AI is by looking at the graph weights, which in the case of A implies B is very simple, okay? And that is what essentially correlation will do for you. In the case of A, B, and C implies Y, it's a bit more complicated, but there's what you can do with linear regression. And this is what we'll call the causal betas. And then you have to do that all over the tree, all over your network. And then you understand what causes what and with what probabilities. This is the way to do causal AI. Okay, so for those of you who already know causal AI, my apologies, you already knew this. If you didn't, this is how you do causal AI. And now that's how you can start to try to make a difference. Because if you know these things, then you know which node to tweak if you want to obtain the result that you're looking for. And if you can't, then each one of these arrows are implications that you may be able to tweak. I'll show you how. The first thing is the difficult part with doing this is this type of causal tree creation. By the way, I showed you here something that has 7 nodes. In practice, you will have 100, 200, or 1,000 nodes. So this is something which is okay. But the way you would do this calibration is the first step, which is you can establish causality with large language models. That essentially tells you in the graph what points to what. That summarizes our knowledge, right? Increase of CO2 increases the temperature of the Earth because we have experiments that tells us that. And the graph weights are simple plus ones or minus ones, meaning this implies that or this implies that or nothing. Okay. But then once you know that, then you use traditional statistical inference to actually get the causal betas as I described earlier. And once you have that, then you can actually make a difference. You need this to make a difference. Okay? And I am going to end with some joint work with 4 of my students, which I will summarize with one graph. Actually, one graph. We use prompt engineering to create this is an example of a prompt that we use with ChatGPT. So we can calibrate my graphs and get the plus ones and minus one weights in my graph. And once you do that, then you use that to understand where emissions are coming from. And this is the causal graph we got for emissions. We see that of the factors that I mentioned earlier, that I can explain what implies what, I can see that surface area implies population size, which then implies urban population, which affects electricity production, which then affects fossil fuel consumption. GDP is there somewhere in the middle, and then all of that leads to emissions. And we have the betas for that. So that means that with something like this, you can start to take action. You know where to go, you know what to tweak, and you know how you could decrease emissions. Okay? So with that, I end this formal part of the presentation, and now we are ready for the participation. Mujeeb is going to tell us what he thinks and how we continue this conversation.
Thank you very much. Really interesting presentations. Maybe I'll just start with an overview of who I am and how my segment relates to the presentations that were given previously. So I'm in the ADIA infrastructure department. Our mandate is to invest in infrastructure assets on a global basis. And our main mandate is to maximize risk-adjusted returns to ADIA. We're one of the several investment departments in ADIA. We invest in infrastructure on a global basis, mostly in OECD countries, but also increasingly in non-OECD countries. And the way we categorize infrastructure globally is by 4 sectors. So I head up energy, which includes renewable energy as well as conventional energy. The example that Soyoung gave is actually very interesting. We have invested in solar plants, PV plants in California, and we're looking at investing potentially in CCGTs in PJM and other sort of similar energy assets. In addition, we also invest in liquefied natural gas, liquefaction, regas, etc., pipelines, hydrogen, biomass, etc., so across the energy spectrum. The other sectors we have are regulated utilities, anything that's rate-based regulated, water, gas, electric, waste, transportation, which is most people think of when they think of infrastructure, airports, ports, toll roads, etc., and digital infrastructure. So in energy, I think what you mentioned is some conclusions from your Clyfin research is very interesting. That it makes sense to maintain a diversified portfolio because some of the risks natural that you found while modeling out the impacts of climate scenarios, both transition risk and physical risk, do offset each other if you invest in conventional versus renewable energy. The research that you did is very interesting. It helps us kind of look at impacts from a physical risk perspective as well as a transition risk perspective on different assets. And I noticed with interest that CCGTs are probably more exposed, at least it looks like from your research, and coal plants being the most exposed, solar PV maybe being more resilient to climate scenarios, which I would generally agree with based on our experience. The one thing I would say is that as investors, we take that into account when we enter. In a couple of different ways. One is that the leverage that we apply to different assets kind of reflects our perception of how risky these assets are. So in some assets which we feel are more exposed, we come in with much less leverage.
Yeah.
Typically won't be 70 to 80%, as you mentioned, but might be a much lower level. And then the underwriting also reflects that as well. What we've seen in returns on renewables, because they're more resilient to climate, tend to be lower.
Yeah.
And I think there's some empirical data that if you looked at the return on invested capital of renewable energy companies versus conventional fossil fuel companies, significantly higher ROICs on fossil fuel companies versus renewables. So if we enter into a conventional energy investment, generally it's higher return with more upfront cash flows. So that sort of essentially helps de-risk you because many of these scenarios don't play out until the long term. And in fact, the scenarios have more of an impact on equity versus debt, I feel, because debt is normally repaid within a relatively short time frame, whether it's 5 years to maybe at the max 15 years. Whereas equity investors, we're in it for the much longer term, which means that we really have to think of longer term impacts. So the kind of work you do, we do it as well, and we look a lot at our investments when we enter into those kind of investments with those kind of risks. The one interesting thing about the energy sector is there's so many iterative impacts that if you change one variable, it can have an offsetting impact on other factors as well. For example, if we think that renewable energy is going to come in, it's very cheap, it's going to displace coal and gas, therefore power prices will go down, therefore conventional assets are exposed. I think that's generally true. But one thing we've observed is that renewables are intermittent. The sun doesn't shine at night, the wind only blows when it blows, and those assets only generate at those times. And then like we've seen in places like California's so-called duck curve impact, which means there's a lot of generation when the sun is shining in the afternoon, and then when the sun goes down in the evening, power prices, there's not enough generation, and power prices go up. In fact, during the afternoon, power prices may actually turn negative, which means that you actually have to pay someone to generate power, versus the other way around. We've seen this in California and Australia as well. And then when the sun comes down, all of a sudden you have a huge amount of solar capacity that just falls off the grid, and then you need to ramp up gas. The advantage of gas is it's flexible. It can go up and down, and the power, you can't really store electricity. So you need to generate when the demand is there. So I think gas can capture a lot of margins kind of in those shoulder periods, and renewable energy isn't generating. So I think that's sort of an interesting impact. And then we've also looked at things like carbon pricing, CCS mandates. It's, as you mentioned, it's very granular. Each asset has different impacts based on where it's located, its unique characteristics, its fuel supply contract, its offtake contract. For example, some assets we buy, they have offtake agreements which have change in law provisions. So you can actually pass through carbon taxes to your offtaker. Now, in those instances, we have zero exposure to carbon tax, or in fact CCS mandates, because if you have to install control equipment, then you can pass the cost through as well. So again, it's very granular kind of asset level. But I think at a high level, the conclusions make sense. And then also other impacts are that if you have carbon taxes, that could force a lot of coal capacity out of the market. In markets like the US, for example, coal is 20% of the PJM power market stack. So if you have a lot of carbon taxes and the price doesn't rise to reflect all of those, then coal plants basically make losses. And then you'll have coal plants shutting down sort of en masse. And that means the lights go out in the biggest market in the US, which is sort of unsustainable. So you basically need very high power prices to incentivize addition of new generating capacity to the market, which means instead of a carbon tax scenario being negative, it could actually be a positive for gas-fired power plants. So I think there's many different impacts. In fact, we hire consulting firms to run those scenarios for us, and they have very complex kind of dispatch models. Every time they run it, it takes 3 or 4 days. So you can imagine how much they iterate. Very high-powered computers run those scenarios because they're global models, because energy is global. An impact in the US gas price has an impact on gas prices in Japan, in Europe, because the US is a big exporter of LNG. Qatar is another exporter, so is Australia. So energy markets are globally linked. So you really have to kind of model global interactions as well as local interactions, which make it, I think, very complicated. I think just a few things we've seen sort of from energy transition perspective. I'll start by giving some of our high-level comments based on kind of investing in energy, just for the edification of the group. So I think one thing we've looked at is energy transitions. So everybody talks about energy transitions. Is there really an energy transition, or is it an energy addition? I think that's what Steve Chu mentioned in the morning session. We had Dan Yergin, who's a noted journalist and expert in energy. He presented to the ADIA, and he also noted that as new sources of energy continue to be discovered, they don't actually phase out existing sources. They just keep adding on top of existing sources. Even biomass, like burning wood or other biological matter, which is the oldest source of energy, even that is not decreasing. The absolute use of biomass is increasing. Coal is not decreasing. We had a record year for coal use last year. Many markets like China and India, which are the biggest emitters, they have net zero targets, but they're actually adding more coal plants to support kind of rising standards of living and population. So I think we look at energy transition as an energy addition, and we feel it's important to invest across all sources of energy because they all have a use and a purpose. And as you mentioned, there's some natural intrinsic hedges between the different types of energy. I think one other issue we're seeing in the energy transition is who pays for the energy transition? Are people willing to pay extra for green energy? For example, in LNG liquefaction projects we invest in, we have the option to offer our off-takers, which are like Japanese utilities or companies like Shell that have big portfolios. We say, would you like greener LNG? LNG with carbon capture, etc., but it's going to cost you more. And they say, no, we don't want to pay more. So that's just the reality on the ground, I think. And then if you ask consumers, if all else being equal, yes, they would prefer green energy, but if they have to pay 10-20% more on the electric bill in general, there's not a lot of appetite to pay for that. And then with balance sheets getting stretched, the energy transition is costly. So I guess that's one of the key questions we see. And no one has an answer for that, is the willingness to pay for the energy transition. I think the other thing you mentioned, Luis, really interesting, your research on kind of the energy emissions globally, and different countries having different profiles. And many factors obviously contribute to that, but the one thing is that if you just look broadly across the OECD world and the non-OECD world, i.e. the richer countries and the poorer countries, you'll see the energy use per capita is maybe a tenth of what it is in the more rich countries. And then the carbon emissions are also much lower. And I guess we can unpack the correlation, but generally as these countries industrialize, they use more electricity, the GDP production goes up, the transportation use goes up, all else being equal, you'd expect emissions to go up. So then I guess, and you and I discussed, probably means we need to revise the budgets upwards to account for those factors. But what that means in practice is you have billions of people in the world, like 1 billion people don't have access to electricity. You have 4 or 5 billion people who are living at much lower standards of living than the West. And it is in their right to industrialize and have better standards of living, and hence will probably result in increasing carbon emissions. And so what does that mean? What that means is there's a certain carbon budget, so we don't exceed 1.5 centigrade or even 2 or 3 centigrade. And we're not meeting that budget. We've exceeded that budget in no foreseeable timeline. Are we expected to be under that budget, especially if non-OECD countries continue to industrialize? So another thing we're seeing is if there's 2 ways you can react to climate change. One is you can either say, I'm going to mitigate climate change by reducing carbon emissions, or the second approach is climate change is happening, extreme climate things are happening, I need to protect my infrastructure, I need to protect my country, I need to protect communities. How do I do that? Because by reducing carbon emissions, the benefit of that is global. If I reduce emission, CO2 emission here in Abu Dhabi, the benefit is all over the world. And then someone else may increase their emissions and I get the negative impact of that. So then the question is kind of the alignment of incentives on who actually pays for that mitigation. If the benefit is global and the negative impact is global as well. So I think we'll see, and this is our view, we'll see probably more focus on adaptation. Adaptation is, what do I mean by that? Like Rotterdam, for example, Holland is a country that's been living with sort of climate change, Armageddon type scenarios for centuries. It's a low-lying country, they're prone to flooding, surges in sea levels. So Rotterdam built something called a sea gate, just like 2 Eiffel Towers laid on its side. So when the tide rises, the sea gate just comes down and it stops Rotterdam from flooding. Now this was not an easy or a cheap project to build, it cost billions of dollars. The city of Venice invested in a series of sea gates which sort of help prevent flooding of Venice as well. Again, that took about 10-15 years, vastly over budget. So these things are not cheap, but I think the benefit for that is that it protects you locally, and the benefit is local versus global. Another thing, extreme heat. I think one way people can respond to that, and we've seen that in the UAE here, is air conditioning. Air conditioning helps mitigate most of the impacts of extreme heat. In countries like India, South Asia, they're expected to, if you look at a graph of who gets hurt by climate change, I think South Asia is one of the countries that, or regions that get hurt the most, whereas North Europe, places like that benefit. So investment in air conditioning, we've seen the impact here. We have some of the most extreme heat here, and we're well adjusted because of air conditioning. And I think the IEA in the latest forecast, there's a lot of talk about AI in data centers and how much they'll increase demand for power. But not many people talk about air conditioning. The IEA said they expect air conditioning to be 2 to 3 times bigger than data centers because that will be a critical element for countries to adapt to extreme heat as well. So I think it's a complex issue. What we see overall is all these climate change scenarios that you pointed out, they're solving for a single variable, which is CO2. But we think there's many other variables that need to be solved for as well, sort of in the spirit of social justice, whether it's human prosperity, standard of living, access to energy, access to electricity, widely available, reducing other sources of pollution, that's SO2, NO2, mercury, particulate matter, etc. There's many other variables that we think need to be optimized as well. And we think it's difficult to just have a sole focus on CO2, and one needs to look at all those other variables as well when designing the optimal energy system and optimizing. So just a few thoughts I had. Happy to take any questions or you may have on that or from the audience on any of those.
If I may, thanks for commenting, give your feedback on our presentation. This is great because I was nodding really head to your very first comment or reflection on solar, because this is something that we are actually constantly seeing from our the demonstration result, that like a solar PV is extremely high in the cash flow projections and also DSCR and as well as IRR. And then you are exactly right that renewables are highly reliant on equity, usually like 100% equity in the United States. So it's, like I was thinking, oh, maybe capital structure itself is not really fitting to the DSCR projection. So that was why we included the IRR projection to it. But it was very interesting that you are actually observing that type of high performance of it. I like the part that you actually mentioned about this, compounding impact. I think this is a very complex issue, and then really I want it to highlight from our research process, because it's very dangerous that like academia, because we have to look into like a very narrow scope on like a really become rigorous on like defining the empirical relationship on 1 to the B or something, but in reality like for example precipitation and then like a temperature rise is like highly likely happening in the all together, and then like when it happens to the infrastructure asset, it's not really coming into like a simple aggregation. Like when you isolate this one and then that, and then you have 10 out of here and 5 over here, and then if this one is happening together, it'll be 15. I don't think that's going to happen. So, like when we are having the compounding impact of multiple risk factors, how that actually translates into the value, I think that this is something that we have to really think about, and then maybe at the lab too. And then the last thing that you kind of like mentioning about more like a broader picture is about the energy planning. I mean, thanks that you are coming from the energy sector. I think this is very important that, energy planning is not only whether this specific asset is valuable or not, and then, also, yes, you are looking for the, you are avoiding the default condition, or you are maximizing your asset valuation. But in the meantime, you have to make sure that you are actually providing the stream, like the consistent you are meeting consistently the demand of the energy at the same time. So we are actually delivering the multiple objective at the same time. And then as an investor's point of view, in the meantime, you have to, maximize the risk-adjusted return at the same time. So it's very complex problem. And then, I'm really glad that we are actually talking about this in this, interdisciplinary setting. The last thing that maybe this is a question to you. I think this is my very first time who is actually from the industry is highlighting and then also rationalizing why we have to invest in the adaptation versus the mitigation. I think the investing in the adaptation can only come the investors who have the long-term perspective. And then, in the ADIA, how are you, do you have any measure or, or even not only the quantitative way, but, the culture that is actually recognizing this long-term benefit of the adaptation when you are making the investment decisions?
Yeah, no, I mean, ADIA is a long-term investor. And I think that's how we differentiate ourselves to our counterparties, because we don't have a requirement to exit like many private equity funds do, who have to exit in 5 or 6 years. So I think having a long-term view can really make you a more effective investor and allow you to maximize returns. Because in one extreme, if you look at public market investors, or if you look at day traders who are looking for sort of hourly fluctuations in response to news and other trends, or if you look at kind of regular investors who are looking from quarter to quarter, they don't really care. So we look for many years, and that lets us be patient. And for example, if we're investing in a company that's building large construction projects, like we've invested in companies that have built toll roads to get from a central business district to an airport, or we invested in companies that are building a large sort of $20 billion LNG liquefaction project, which will take 4 to 5 years to build.
Yeah.
So if that's in the public market will not give any credit for that because it's too long. The cash flows won't come up. So we find that we can look at those opportunities and probably make better returns than we would otherwise, because there's lots of capital that will avoid those opportunities. So I think having a long-term view is a competitive advantage, and it lets you increase your returns relative to other investors who are more short-term focused. In terms of adaptation and infrastructure, I mean, it's an asset class we're looking at quite keenly. In our experience, it's mostly been financed at the government level using public funds. The private sector hasn't had to step in so far. We're a private sector investor. But we think it's just a matter of time before it becomes more mainstream. So we sort of evaluate all these emerging trends across energy transition, whether it's nuclear fusion or green hydrogen or carbon capture or ammonia. Those are sort of all vectors we look at when we're trying to figure out where the world of energy is headed, where a green swan could come from that could sort of transform the investing landscape. So we try to make sure we get early warning signs of that. And the good thing about the energy sector is that it's, I think, less prone to disruption than, say, technology sectors. Like you could have a killer app that displaces, I don't know, ChatGPT with something else, and then it's the hot app of the day. And that can happen overnight almost. I think it's much more difficult in energy because it's constraints of the physical world. You're actually talking, it's not about bytes and data, it's about actual movements in the physical world. And those are much harder to find breakthrough technologies. And I think there's a whole cycle, and we've seen this over previous energy additions as well. When a new technology comes in, it starts small, it's at a pilot scale, then it scales up. Then there's economies of scale as it's more widely adopted, which brings the cost down. We saw that happen with wind and solar. So I think we have quite a few early warning signals, so we can actually tell when that green swan is a green duckling and then it's growing up, so we can kind of keep an eye on it. It doesn't just come out of the woodwork and surprise us. Yeah, at least in the energy sector.
Question there? There's a few questions.
I have a thought and a question. So in the current state, a majority of the people, as you mentioned, Mujeeb, are exposed to little energy or I would say low quality of energy. At the same time, such countries like the ones in Africa and Asia are contributing positively to the CO2 emissions through the forests that they have and the agriculture. My question is, with the environmental limitations set on the CO2 emissions, how can we control the future when all of those countries will start industrializing and developing, like the West, for example, and using more electricity? And at the same time, is it fair to put such controls when the countries want to develop and want to industrialize, and the West took that advantage or the opportunity to do it in the past 200 years?
It's a great question. Maybe I can start, and then maybe Luis, you can.
Yeah, so this is what drives a lot of my research, because it's important to understand when you look at a country, there's this division, global north, global south. You're talking about countries which are clearly below their quota of emissions. And these are the countries that are clearly above their quota of emissions. So how can you objectively state what your emissions should be? And that's why I did that study, which is clearly indicating that don't look at your historicals. I just look at the kind of country you are, how many people live there, how big you are, and then give you your baseline. And what I think is happening, I hope, after COP29, is that you can start to have countries trading with each other, right? So first of all, the countries which are below quota, the countries which have not yet developed, the countries that have not been emitting for the last 250 years, like Great Britain, right? Then that is recognized, so they get that emission quota, right? I think that is what we should see, but for that to happen, we need accounting systems. See, there's something very interesting about your conversation that I want to now look at from a science fiction perspective that links with your question, which is accounting systems are about 100 years old. But accounting systems account for the value of many things, but others don't have a room in accounting systems. Accounting systems don't value data. Accounting systems don't value things that now we know, like the value of a community. And accounting systems assume that water is free and air is free, right? Once we start to change the accounting systems, all of that changes. And then a lot of the discussions about whether this is profitable or not, well, once the accounting system changes, profitability will change too. I think we just need a more complete accounting system that takes into account not just the value of physical assets, but the value of intangibles, such as clean air or water. And then we can use traditional accounting and traditional investing to make a lot of these decisions. But for that, we need to know that, and we don't. We don't have that everybody knows how much money you spend on a day, you know how much money you make on a day, but you don't know how much water you consume in a day, right? The average consumption of a person who eats meat is 100,000 liters per year more than a vegetarian, for example, right? But you don't know that. That accounting is needed. So that's my opinion.
If I can add,
Jess? Sorry.
if I add one more, so I think it's been in almost like a theory type of thing. So like the energy consumption and economic growth, and then the carbon emission are the ones who has like a inherently correlated, but like now that we are seeing decoupling of those connections and so on, I think the ideal case is that if the country is actually get their position by having like advanced technology and so on, but usually like the ones who are actually having very strong correlation among those three are the ones who are actually need more development. So then like from the policy perspective, we can also think about what might be the external instrument that can like intervene these strong connections. Like for example, the carbon like a carbon trading can be the one, by reducing carbon, you can still be, that can be the another source of your revenue, and then that can be adding to your, economic growth and so on. So, I think it should be coming inside out to the outside to the inside, that, yes, we have to develop a lot of, carbon efficient, technology and so on, but at the same time, what are the external, policies that can intervene this relationship? Yeah.